Hello and welcome to Get Into Law, a brief video brought to you from the Careers and Employability Service at the University of Greater Manchester. In the following 10 minutes, we're going to look at some of the key qualification routes that lead to legal practice roles. We'll explore some of the legal services and in which sectors they lie across England and Wales in particular. For the purposes of the overview, we'll look at the four most common routes as legal practices, and that would include solicitor, barrister, paralegal, and legal executives. We'll also look at some alternative careers involved in legal services and legal practice. And it's worth noting the huge rise of roles such as paralegals and specialist lawyers in today's labour market. So firstly, solicitor route. So if we're looking at you taking an LLB, a law degree, typically solicitors can follow on from that experience to potentially work across law firms or perhaps in-house legal services, whether that be in commercial sector, within corporate law, or perhaps in public sector, or even government. The key role really of a solicitor in all of those different environments is to advise clients, draft documents, provide negotiations, and they may represent in lower courts. The typical, most common pathway following an LLB law degree is to then look at legal work experience. And developing that whilst you're actually on the LLB is very important. So you can look at opportunities such as vacation schemes, mini pupilages, other networking experiences, often platforms such as Law Careers Net are very good at finding opportunities for you to perhaps get involved with there. As part of the new qualification to become a solicitor, the SQE examinations have been brought into place since September 2021. And this involves two examinations, the SQE1 and the SQE2. On top of it, you also need to get 2 years of qualifying work experience. That's called the QWE. And that can be brought together from a variety of different sources and experiences. So if you are perhaps in the position of having a legal advice bureau or clinic within the university, that would be a very beneficial starting point. The barrister route. So this has differences to going down the solicitor route. A barrister is essentially a specialist advocate. They're usually self-employed and based within chambers, or they can be employed directly by organisations. They provide expert advice and they represent clients in court directly. The pathway following an LLB law degree, it's important that you meet all the academic bar requirements, and the LLB is a great starting point for that. You then need to look at joining an Inn of Court. And within that, you need to pass the bar training course and complete required qualifying sessions within your inn. There are 4 Inns of Court across England and Wales. They are Temple, Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn. Temple actually have 2 inns. There's Inner and Middle Inn. Once you complete the bar course, you then need to go on to complete a 1-year pupillage. And that, again, will be in chambers. It is highly competitive route. So any evidence, examples of networking, developing strong advocacy, debating skills, and having a strong academic record is essential for this field. A further role is a paralegal role. Paralegals essentially support solicitors, potentially barristers, with research and researching client cases and making client contact and drafting documents. It is possible to gain an entry-level paralegal role from an LLB degree. And within that, it is also possible with an employer to perhaps qualify and complete your SQE and qualifying work experience within that role with the agreement of your employer. It is, however, a standalone responsibility and role in its own right, but it can be used towards a stepping stone into a solicitor role, if you so wish. The legal executive is another role which is on the rise within England and Wales. And they are specialist fee earners. So they do their own client work. They do provide casework. Then the route typically taken for chartered legal executive is through the SILEX route. And that does involve professional examinations as well. It does give you regulated lawyer status. So it is on a path which is equivalent to a solicitor. However, you perhaps can't practice in the same amount of specialist areas typically as a solicitor may do. So why consider these roles? Well, first of all, you can essentially earn whilst you're training in those roles, if that is offered. And it's a more flexible pathway into gaining your solicitor qualification and status. It's also, as I mentioned, a very high growth rate within these roles across law firms. Another opportunity is to think about, well, where would you like to work? It doesn't have to be within specific law firms. It could be working within charities. It could be working within quangos or government departments. It could be working within a corporate or financial institution where you'd be advising on similar things such as contracts, regulation, compliance, risk. The typical pathway still remains the same. However, where you work and who you work with and for can vary massively within this career and this path. So I mentioned there's many, many different environments where a law degree lends itself very well. And as you can see on the screen now, it could go across public sector, health, government, local government, charities, specific commercial enterprises, even the armed forces. Here's a selection of potential careers where a law degree would be exceptionally well regarded. As you can see there, there's quite a wide breadth. One resource which is very useful to look at alternatives, an alternative career, is Prospects, prospects.ac.uk, where you can view current labour market information and compare different roles that are involved within legal services or legal practice. So I'd advise you to have a look on that site. Here's some further organisations which are currently employing solicitors, legal practices across all those different sectors. So as you can see, civil service, charitable sector, organisations such as Crown Prosecution Service, local authority. Many roles exist in all of these key areas. So what could you start doing now and in the future to develop your experience and work towards these routes? There's lots of things that you can start doing even whilst you're at university, perhaps taking your LLB law degree. And even if you're not, you still can be developing these things in any of the degrees that you're undertaking. It is possible to do a conversion law degree if this is a path you wish to take and have not started on an LLB. So look at societies that are within your university. Look at opportunities to debate and get involved in mooting activities. For those that have an interest in perhaps a path towards barrister, you can look at joining Young Barristers Committee. There's lots of external networking events and activities you can get involved in. And as I mentioned before, the Law Careers Net is a very positive platform to establish where you might wish to attend. And always be on the lookout for opportunities such as summer vacation schemes, mini pupilages, where you will get to network and actually work alongside barristers and solicitors. The key skills which are always valued and that you can develop throughout your time at university are really looking at research and drafting, developing your awareness of commercial awareness in particular, and evidence and examples of strong communication skills and teamwork. And as you can see from some of the suggested items here, things like debating, negotiation, mediation, these are all highly valued skills. In addition to this, I would like to mention the Legal Advice Bureau, which is operating on a pro bono basis in the centre of Bolton. What a fantastic opportunity to develop and bring together all of these skills. So get involved. Finally, a few ideas where you can be looking, researching for opportunities to get involved in things such like mini pupilages, vacation schemes, what events are happening locally, what networks could you be tapping into? Well, take a look on the following resources for further ideas. To end with, I'd just like to mention that the Careers and Employability Service will be here to support you along each step of the way. And we do offer a careers drop-in on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays afternoon. In addition to this, you can always book appointments through the Student Hub platform, which is the careers platform. And you can keep in contact with us through that same platform. So thank you for listening.